We're going to talk today again about the Talmud Bavli and maybe a little bit about the Talmud Yerushalmi in our discussion of the history of Jewish law. So, recap. We start everyone with a recap. We started with the Torah. Then the next step was Midrash Halacha, applying the legal teachings to the text. Then all this material had to be organized together thematically, which was the Mishnah. And alongside the Mishnah, there was a file or a couple of files of competition or things that were excluded from the Mishnah called Tosefta. Immediately after the Mishnah was written, the commentary started, because now you have a codified, sealed body of work and you start writing commentary. And the problem with this commentary, it was a sort of freestyle commentary that people sit together and they discuss it and they bring up questions and answers, and sometimes they digress to a different issue. And when the text was put together, sometimes they would add material just because one person said 2 or 3 statements, so they would put it all in one place. Now, and a couple of important differences between the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Talmud. In the Mishnah, when you have a discussion in the Mishnah, and 3 or 4 rabbis are mentioned, you know it's a historical account, meaning this is what happened in the hall of study in the Bet HaMidrash. Rabbi Yehuda was talking to Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon was there, and they said to each other A, B, C, and then they came to a conclusion. In the Talmud, it doesn't happen like that, because it was a work that went on for hundreds of years, and there was never a final editing. I mean, this is debatable. Some people say that the Talmud was edited, that someone went through the Talmud from the beginning to the end and edited and gave it shape. This is the traditional, in the what we call the yeshiva world. This is what people believe, even though there are many proofs from great rabbis that this did not happen. The more plausible scenario is that people just in different places study the material orally, and then when it moves from place to place, people copied it, people edited. As a result, what happens is you read in a page of Gemara, those who study Gemara or Talmud, you'll find out that you could find in one discussion rabbis from different generations. Completely different generations. For example, I just discussed this week the story about the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, right? So the Gemara says Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students, and they all died at one time. And it was between Pesach and Shavuot, and they died of diphtheria, or what they call askara. So there are 4 statements. The first one is anonymous. We don't know who said it, meaning that he had 24,000 students. The second one, it's in the Gemara, but the first one is Tana. Someone said, we don't know who. Second one is also Tana, and they all died between Pesach and Shavuot. And then the third person, Rabbi Haim Ovadia, lived 200-300 years after the Bar Kochva revolt, when Rabbi Akiva's student died, and he adds the next leg of information, and he says they died in a plague. And finally, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, who lived another 100 years later, adds the element that they died. The type of plague was askara, which is diphtheria. But the interesting thing is, you read it, you see one piece of information. You think you could read it like, you think it's all written by one person or by a group of rabbis who lived in the same period, but it was not. And this is at least in chronological order. Sometimes you have a page of Gemara when the names, if you would put a date next to each name in the sugya, in the discussion, they live 100 years before, after. There's no order there. And that makes it very complicated. But that also shows us, if you want to analyze the Talmud more critically, you'll be able to tell when was the discussion written, and if the editor, or let's put it, the person who edited stuff, Where did he add it? Because the language can tell you, and the names of the rabbis. In any case, the Talmud, be it as it may, the Talmud became in around the year 400, 500. We believe that the work on the Talmud has ceased, meaning officially nothing else was added to the Talmud. That was the time of two great rabbis, Rav Ashi and Ravina. And the Talmud refers to them as the end of the scholarship of Talmud. So now that this is what the state of the Talmud, that they were the final authority of the Talmud, people understand that to mean that they were editors, that they, like Rabbi Nasi, edited the Mishnah, they edited the Talmud. But that's not the case. What happened was that up until their time, the yeshivot worked in a way that individual rabbis would they would add their input to the Talmud. After their time, for another 200 years at least, there was another generation of rabbis who are called Savoraim. The rabbis of the Talmud are called Amoraim. The rabbis of post-Talmudic times are called Savoraim. Savoraim now, those Savoraim, for many hundreds of years, people believed they didn't produce anything. They were just memorizers. They would just memorize the Talmud, and they were the ones who transmitted the information to the next generation. Before even looking at the literature, we know, I think from experience, that this is impossible. It's impossible to have 200 years of scholars that would write nothing, add nothing, change nothing, right? And indeed, when in recent generations, people started looking at the Gemara more critically, also with the help of some manuscripts, and also with the help of something called the Spanish Ganesha, pieces of Talmud, pages of Talmud that were discovered in Spain, in the strangest place that you can imagine. They found out that when the Spanish Inquisition confiscated books from Jews, not always they burned them, because they were written on parchment. It's a precious material. So what they did, they used it as filling for binding of books. And those books ended up being part of the public notaries around Spain. That goes all the way back to the 1400s.
Some of them are
Chala Sefer.
no, Library of Congress.
Library of Congress, right. There you have samples. Right, but the Professor Haim Dimitrovsky was the first one who started looking into them, and he found like pieces of the Talmud that are of a different version than what we have today, meaning they evolved a little differently. So we know today that there was a lot of work done on the Talmud and added. So today it could affect halakha. Some people are willing to go there to analyze it and see how it affects our understanding of halakha. Some people say we don't care. What's written is written, that's it. I don't care how it was written or if someone else changed and added his opinion. I wrote a while ago, remember I wrote about meat and dairy, right? For example, the Gemara, the Mishnah says that you don't eat meat and dairy during the same meal. That's it. You don't eat meat and dairy during the same meal. Meaning, according to the Mishnah, you finish the meal, you said Birkat Hamazon, the meal is over, right? Now you can have dairy. That's what the Gemara says. Like the French, like the Yankees, like the Dutch, right? And that's what the French Jews did for hundreds of years. It was the Savoraim, those anonymous authors, that added into the Talmud a statement about one rabbi who would not eat until the night. And many years later, the Shulchan Aruch adopted this halakha and put it in, and that's it. And now we're all stuck with Sephardim with 6 hours. But if you ask the question, where did it come from? It came from an anonymous source, and the practice of one rabbi that affected everyone. So this is and very briefly the story of Savoraim. But parallel to the Talmud, Bavli, I mentioned earlier, there was another Talmud called Talmud Yerushalmi. That's the same commentary on the Mishnah that was written in Eretz Israel. And the people in Eretz Israel had an advantage over the people of Bavel because they were closer to the source. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who edited the Mishnah, lived in Israel, and his students lived in Israel. So if you needed to ask someone directly what is written, what is your intention, you have the living tradition over there. But if you go to the yeshivot today, almost nobody studies the Talmud Yerushalmi, right? You do Daf Yomi of the Bavli. People don't study the Talmud of Eretz Israel. The question is why. So if you ask what is the traditional view of that, they'll tell you we don't rely on the Talmud Yerushalmi for halachot, and its language is not easily understood, so we cannot study this book. It's very difficult. The truth is a little different. It actually has to do with politics. The Talmud Yerushalmi was doomed because of the politics between the schools in Babylonia and the schools in Eretz Israel. And that happened around the 8th century. Meaning, this is about 200 years after the Talmud was over, the discussion was over. And when we say that there was a yeshiva or a school in Bavel, and yeshiva in Eretz Israel, it's not just about students, it's about what? About what? Politics. Think about Harvard and Yale, right? Besides prestige, besides name, what is the thing that they really fight for is money. You need money. You need sponsors and scholarship and funds, etc. And the more prestigious school will get better funding, right? It's all over. Nothing has changed. So the schools in Babylonia had their following, and the schools in Eretz Israel had their following. Mostly the Jews who lived in Italy were connected, because in the 8th century there were already Jews in Italy. They were connected to the school of Eretz Israel. Meanwhile, the schools of Babylonia, the Yeshivot of Bavel, controlled the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. So everybody out except for Italy corresponded with Bavel, and they sent donations, and they sent questions. And when you send a question, and you know that the only way you can get an answer is from the center in Bavel, that becomes your lifeline. So you will support it. And at a certain point, the rabbis in Bavel were concerned that the Israeli rabbis are getting too powerful. So they started a campaign against them. A campaign that was meant to diminish them and say that their Torah is not valid. This is recorded in a letter written by a man by the name of Pirkoi ben Bavoy. He was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Gaon in the 8th century. Rabbi Yehuda Gaon was a Gaon in Bavel, was the head of one of the yeshivot. And he says that everybody knows that you cannot rely on the Torah of the yeshivot of Eretz Israel because Toratan Torat Shmad, because they were under the rule of the Christians. Shmad is paganism. Because they were under the rule of the Christians, they couldn't learn well, they didn't know the laws, and therefore we don't rely on them. And this even affected the Midrash. There are many proofs for that. One of the proofs, by the way, that it comes from a later period, he praises the yeshivot of Babylonia. And he says those yeshivot in Babylonia never went to exile under the Romans and the Greeks, Edom ve'Yavan. The Romans and the Greeks. This is a little hint, in the historical context. Why is it strange, Jonathan? Greeks are first, right?
But
should have been
mentioned first. Yes.
Right. Should have been the Greeks and the Romans, because the Greeks came to Eretz Israel in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and the Romans came much later, 200 years later. Why is that person who lives in the 8th century writes Romans and Greeks? Because for him, what he remembers, first came the Romans, the destruction of the temple, and then the Christians, the Byzantine Empire, which is for them associated with Greece. So we know that was the case. So what happened as a result? What happened as a result was that it took root. people started believing that really the Yerushalmi Talmud is not reliable. As a result, they didn't study it. Or, you had 2 courses in front of you. Let's say you go to school, to university, right? You have Yerushalmi Talmud, Bavli Talmud. One of them, they say, this is important, this is not important. Okay, you're not going to study the Yerushalmi Talmud. After a while, you're not going to have teachers who are well versed in the Yerushalmi Talmud. And in the state of affairs as it was at the time, the text was delivered orally, written, not edited. It became more and more obscure. You couldn't decipher the text. So it was a cycle. The less people studied, the more complicated it became. And have in mind that a lot of the words in the Talmud Yerushalmi are words in Greek and in Latin. Now, how many words do you need from the language to have to use in a daily conversation? How many words do you need to be able to converse in a language? You know?
Approximately 50,000.
No.
Less?
1,000. If you know 1,000 words, that's enough to hold a conversation. You use in all of you use 5,000 words. Of the 50,000 that you know. So in the Talmud Yerushalmi, there are about 3,000 words in Greek. Meaning it really turns the Talmud into what people say, it's Greek to me, it's Greek to me. If you don't know the exact meaning, you're lost. And we have this problem, by the way, also in the Talmud Bavli, but with less intensity, because most of the foreign words in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, are Persian, because they were under the Persian Empire. So, and today, by the way, it's a very serious field of study. Professor Yaakov Elman in YU, and one of my friends in LA, and other people are working on studying the book of law of the Persian Empire, the Pahlavi. It's called the Book of the Thousand Colors. That's the name of the legal codex, and comparing that to the monetary and other laws in the Talmud. So, as I said, as a result, the Talmud became more and more complicated and eventually abandoned. The only one, not the only one, but one of the real scholars, one of the scholars who really paid attention to the Yerushalmi was Maimonides. And Maimonides, before he wrote his codex, which we'll get to later, he wrote halachot based on the Yerushalmi Talmud. And that's why a lot of what he wrote in his codex doesn't go in line with the Talmud. So you see, now it started getting more complicated. When you had the Torah, you had the commentary. Then Midrash Halacha started splitting. Then Rabbi Yehuda said, let's organize all the material. He creates the Mishnah. Then people write commentary. Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi. Then they start fighting. Your Talmud is not good enough. We're not going to study it. So after, fast forward 300 years, they are completely different schools. And those who did write commentary on the Yerushalmi tried to reconcile it with the Bavli. But I'll give you one example of where, how they differ in terms of understanding the text. The Mishnah in Masechet Bava Metzia speaks about monetary laws, speaks about lost objects. So it says, what happens if 2 people come to court and they hold a garment and they both say that they found it? Now the way it's phrased in the Mishnah, it says, "Ze omer kula sheli." So "Ze omer ani mitzatia, v'ze omer ani mitzatia." "Ze omer kula sheli, v'ze omer kula sheli." Yahloku. One says, "I found it." The other one says, "No, I found it." One says, "It's all mine." The other one says, "No, it's all mine." Now, the Yerushalmi, the Talmud discusses this Mishnah long. Anyone who studied in a Hebrew day school looks at me now and says, "Yeah, I know what you're talking about because I suffered through this discussion also," right? And what bothers the Talmud is the repetition of the words. Why do you have to say this one says I found it, this one says I found it, this one says it's mine, this one says it's mine? You could have written this one says I found it and it's all mine. This one says I found it on its own mind. Or you could have said, like Jonathan said, both of them claim the same thing. I found it, it's all mine. Why do you have to break it down? Long discussion. Eventually, they come to the conclusion it's two separate cases. One speaks about finding a lost object. The other is about a case of a purchase. So they say their one case is that one says, I found it, one says, I found it. Meaning they just grabbed it and they claim that they both found it either simultaneously or one is lying. The second case, this one says, it's all mine. This one says, it's all mine. Speaks of a situation where they both come with an object and they claim that they bought it and paid for it. And now we have to find out who bought it and who paid for it. So the Talmud says now, wait a second. Who did you buy it from? I mean, it's not like today that everybody sells everything, right? You had specific vendors. What is it? They hold the garment. And the shmata business back then, you knew exactly, okay, someone sold a robe. He knows how many robes he sold. They're not shipping 50,000 a day. He sells 3-4 objects. Let's go to the vendor and ask him, right? Who did you sell it to? Reuven? Those are two classic names, right? Reuven or Shimon? They say no. We can't ask him that. Why? Because both of them paid him. What happened was that they both put money on his desk and on the counter and they grabbed the object together. So they say, so what's the problem? So they both paid. So give them another one. Okay, or give the money back to one of them. They say no. It was the last one in the store, and both of them want the object and they don't want the money. So now, here's the problem. It's an interesting commentary, right? But what is the problem? The problem is you look at the text that gives you the law. It doesn't make sense for the codifier, the person who wrote the law, to write such a complicated and rare case. How often does it happen? Even back then, the two people would come to the store, would fight over the last object, would throw money on the table, would take it, would hold it together, would come to court with it, right? And there's no more, supply of this. It was the last one on stock. And you can't wait for it to be shipped or to be made. It's very rare. And how do you describe this whole case? This one says it's all mine, this one says it's all mine. How do I know that that's what you're talking about? But that's the methodology of the Babylonian Talmud. To assume that every word that Rabbi-ovadia Nasi wrote was edited and accurate, and therefore there should be no redundancy, and therefore I'm going to narrow down the case in the Mishnah to the less narrowest possibility. Meanwhile, the Talmud Yerushalmi would say of something like that. It's not a repetition. It's just this is the way people talk. When you tell the story, let's say you're the clerk at court, come back home, and they ask you what happened today in court. Oh, we had those two people fighting. They came with a garment. This one says it's all mine. This one said I found it. That's the way you relate the story. So, but those are little things. But from here, there could be major splits in halacha between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. So today, there's a movement that calls to revive the teachings of the Yerushalmi. Look into it and see maybe there are certain things in halacha that could be reconsidered. There's a book that lists all the differences, Sefer HaMinagim, Sefer HaHilukim, Shebnei Bnei Ma'arav Lebnei Mizrah, the differences between the Western Jews and Eastern Jews. Western Jews are Babylonian, Eastern is Eretz Israel. One of them, for example, is that, according to one opinion, you don't need the minyan to pray. 7 people are enough. That's an interesting law. And the other things about Shahita. Anyway, this is just one example of how, at that early period, politics influenced the way we learn. But just to conclude, have in mind that we said Mishnah was finally edited and sealed or canonized at the year 215, 225. Then there were about 300-400 years of free activity and commentary without final editing. Then another 200 years of anonymous editing, which really makes it very complicated to come to a clear conclusion. So the next stage, and that's what we'll talk about next time, is the Gaonic period, the Gaonim of Bavel, the Yeshivot of Bavel, and that's where they started putting the halacha again in an organized manner according to things.